We're so happy that you were able to join us this afternoon for the first in our webinar series, highlighting Dr. Tina Ellsworth and Dr. Scott Waring. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them, but please know at the end of the webinar, we will be providing you with a code to enter on the Event Owl screen, the platform that you use to get to this Google Meet. And if you hover over your name while in Event Owl, a drop-down menu will appear, and then you'll see a little spot that reads certificate. You can click that, be able to download a certificate to turn into your district for 1 hour of continuing education credit. So with that, I'm going to switch over to the website. Dr. Waring, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, and welcome everybody, and those of you who are here and those who are watching on the video, definitely appreciate your time and you being here today. This is part of a webinar series, the Using Sources to Teach About Ethics, Equity, and Social Justice, and this is in thanks due to some funding through the University of Central Florida and the Brinson Foundation. And I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Karen Baraima, who is the director of that program and allowed us the funding to be able to have this webinar series. So thank you, Dr. Baraima. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to let my co-presenter and actually the main presenter for today's session, Dr. Tina Ellsworth, introduce herself. Actually, I'm going to turn it over to you if you don't mind, Tina. I'll let you talk, and then I'll go ahead and introduce myself and move straight through the framework. So I'd really love to introduce Dr. Tina Ellsworth. She is a great colleague of mine. We've been working together for a couple of years now. And recently we had a discussion about the topic of blockbusting and how we might be able to teach that through the sources framework. So we started working on that. We put together a nice manuscript. And so I'm thrilled to be able to be working with Dr. Tina Ellsworth. So Tina, if you'll tell them a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Tina and I currently teach in Olathe, Kansas, where I serve as the K-12 Social Studies Coordinator, once a teacher, always a teacher. And I also teach undergraduates at the University of Kansas who are studying to be social studies teachers. Also on the NCSS Board of Directors, and I have great interest in helping teachers learn how to use more inquiry-based strategies and primary source strategies in their classroom. And it's a really great honor to be here with each of you today. I think the world of teachers, and I'm very humbled that each of you could join.
Perfect. And I am as well. And so what we're going to do is basically walk through the stages of the sources framework, give you a little bit of a sense of the framework, and then also we're going to be talking a little bit more about some examples, and then going through specifically, Tina's going to be talking about the topic of blockbusting and how you might teach with that through the sources framework for teaching with primary and secondary sources. As you see in front of you, you'll see a Weebly. I did create a Weebly site for this. And if you're not, so this Weebly that's in front of you, this is actually, the address is blockbusting.weebly.com. You should be able to get that through the chat. And then if you have any questions or any issues with this, don't hesitate to contact either of us. Our information is in the About Us tab. So let's talk about the sources framework. So what is this? This is actually something that I've been working on for about 20, 25 years. A specific source that you feel is absolutely fundamental to learning the content that you're trying to teach. So in a couple of minutes, you're going to see an example with blockbusting. Tina's going to walk you through that stage as well as the others, but you'll see how this all plays out. The second stage is organizing your thoughts. So this is a moment for the students to stop, think, question, and try to think about what they know at that point in time. So kind of that metacognitive process. We're really thinking about their thinking critically here, and we hope that happens at all stages throughout the framework. The third stage is understanding the context. As we probably all know extremely well, since we all love social studies and history, the context is vital. So that's one thing that I argue needs to be done and early. And at this point in time, they've only seen the one primary source. They've thought about what they understand about it, but then they try to put it into the context. You can do this in a lot of different ways. Whenever possible, I try to use children's literature because I love integrating literature in with the use of primary and secondary sources. The fourth stage is reading between the lines. What I argue is at this point in time, they are able to go back and actually think more critically about that fundamental source. They've learned more information. They've learned more about what they really want to ask, those questions. And through those second and third stages, really have a better understanding when they revisit the fundamental source. In the fourth, fifth stage is the corroborate and refute. So this is a stage that not only do they corroborate with their narrative that's being constructed at this point in time, they actually should also refute and find any kind of sources that may actually contradict the narrative that's being laid out in front of them at this point in time. And if you're thinking, well, where do these sources come from? It really depends on the age level and expertise of the students themselves. So if they are more novice level, then the teacher can provide a set of sources. And as they become more expert, then they can actually go out and find and research and develop their own set of sources at this stage of the framework. The next is the establishing the plausible narrative. That's something that I never got a chance to do in my own K-12 schooling, and it really wasn't until my graduate work that I started understanding that the narratives are constructed based on primary and secondary sources, and a lot of the secondary sources that I was being presented with and consuming. So I argue that that is a definite must, that the students need to have an opportunity to construct their own narratives. Now, that doesn't just have to be written text in an essay format. You deem whatever is necessary and most appropriate for you to be able to assess them. So it may be a diary entry, it may be a diorama, it may be a documentary, it might be a historical marker. So whatever may be that narrative is whatever is most appropriate for you and your student population. And then the last stage, that is once again kind of metacognitive process we hope goes through all these different stages, but really at the end, I want them to summarize their final thoughts and think about, what have I learned? And then also, what did I learn about the learning process? So what worked for me? What didn't? How can I make it better next time we go around? Now, as you see, this is similar to some other approaches that you've seen, but many of the other ones maybe utilize too many sources, in my opinion, early on in the process. And keep in mind, this is a framework that is necessary after the introductory steps of understanding primary sources. What are they? What are secondary sources? Analyzing individual sources. So I'm not arguing this is something that starts at the beginning of the year or the beginning of learning with primary and secondary sources. This is a framework for when you are able to have that authentic disciplined inquiry, and you can actually allow your students to investigate topics of interest to them. So this is something that would come a little later in the year, but it is something that I would argue, and I think many of my colleagues would also echo, is that they need these opportunities for authentic disciplined inquiry. So Chris, if you go to the examples, I have published several pieces on the topic of the sources framework with different content. And as I said, Tina and I have been working, we completed a great manuscript that's under review currently on blockbusting and sources. But these are some of the articles. So if there's anything here that you see that you would like, please contact me. I can help you get a copy of them. And my book did come out. And since there's not a whole lot of you here, if you don't have a copy of my book yet and you'd like one, just email me and I'll make sure I send a copy out to you in the coming weeks after you send me the email. But those are the examples. And so at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Tina to talk to you a little bit about the content of blockbusting and then on into the investigation.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here today. And what we'd like to do is to take a little bit of an interactive approach to this webinar, which is kind of hard to do in a webinar. So there's a couple of different things that we're going to have you do. First is try to actively use the chat. But since our group is so small today, we can actually turn our cameras on or turn our microphones on at a couple of different times and engage in a little bit of this dialogue that would be what it would look like with our students in our classroom. So you get a little taste of it, and it's not just being talked at, but we're actually going to walk through some of these things together. So I want to start off first by talking about what is blockbusting. And this is something that I live in the Kansas City area, and it's something that's been very interesting to me my whole time living here is that I know that there's a certain road that you drive down in Kansas City, and it's very predominantly Black population. And then it's like you hit one road and all of a sudden it's white. It's like an invisible line, if you will, that says maybe Black people are supposed to be on this side and white people are supposed to be on this side. And so I began to investigate what is this phenomenon? How did this happen? And my inquiry started about 20 years ago. And throughout my journey of learning more about this and learning about how we all know about Brown v. Board. That was an attempt to desegregate public schools, but we all know that in reality, the communities resegregated themselves in many different ways. Some people just wanted to go live by people that looked like them, which meant distancing themselves from maybe the urban core. So you have this phenomenon known as white flight, where white people were literally just moving out of the way to fight against desegregation. But then you also have people that were taking advantage of both white families and families of color, but particularly Black families, in a concept known as blockbusting, where real estate agents and banks were in cahoots with each other, and they would go into these white communities. They would sell a home to a Black family who they would introduce to the neighborhood. And once the Black family got in, then those same agents would then go knock on the doors of white folks and say, you better get out. Black families are moving in. It's going to be detrimental to the value of your home. The prices are going to plummet and you're going to lose that equity. They capitalized on the fear of the other that a lot of white folks had. This is primarily like in the 1950s and 60s. And they would then sell these or get the white folks out of these neighborhoods, sell them higher priced homes in suburbia that weren't actually worth more, but the agents were just preying on the fears that white people had of Black people. Well, then what would happen is they would turn back around to now that vacant home that sits in the city. They would sell that house to a Black family at a higher rate than what the person just sold the house from. And we're not talking just a small profit margin here. We're talking an exorbitant increase in the cost of housing that actually then turned into tricky financing, where Black families were thinking that they were buying a house, but it was really like a rent to own. And the rent to own never really came to fruition. So they never became homeowners. So this is a very complex system. And as I'm learning more about it, I'm realizing this is not just happening in Kansas City. This is happening all around the country. So what can we do as teachers to build what we call like this racial pedagogical content knowledge and increase our knowledge about the role of race and racism to help explain the physical realities around us? Because that invisible line still exists in many of our cities. It obviously exists between the urban core and suburbia. So how do we answer that question for kids when they start to realize that there are these discrepancies about where people of color are living and where white people are living, or where Black families in particular are living? And what are some potential answers to how and why this happened? Okay, so that is a little bit of background about blockbusting that you would need to know as a teacher to create this kind of investigation. But with kids, the investigation is meant to actually carry them through understanding and revealing to them what happened. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at what Scott was talking about, scrutinizing the fundamental source. I tried to decide what is the one source I want to put in front of kids that'll really get them to question, what is this thing and what messages is it trying to send? And this is one of those resources that actually looking at the sourcing information can help answer some of those questions about the meaning of it. And if at any time you have a question or a comment, you can drop it in the chat and Scott will just interrupt me at any time. Or if you just want to say, hey, I have a quick question and I just want to unmute myself. So this first step in the framework is to scrutinize the fundamental source. So we're going to ask kids, in what ways did blockbusting impact a neighborhood and the individuals living there or moving there? So that is going to be the question we're going to continue to circle back to throughout this entire investigation. And again, the link to this site is in the chat at blockbusting.weebly.com. You can use it. Everything we talk about today will be there. So we called this first source, did you hear what happened to Joe Jitters when Negroes moved in across the street? Before we analyze this source that you see here, if you're sitting in front of your computer, click on that sources analysis sheet for me. And Chris, you can go ahead and do that too and see if it'll pull up in your tab there. Perfect. So I want you to think about this or visualize this graphic organizer as we look at the source together. So we're first going to do the what do you know about what you're seeing? What do you think you know? And what do you wonder about? A lot of times when we pose these questions to kids, they immediately jump to the wonder. But if we can kind of carefully scaffold this to go, what do you know first? And then what do you think you know? And give them a chance to share out. So I'm going to ask some of you to do that. So keep this in mind. Let's go back to the Joe Jitters source. Yes, and Steve says he might have to clarify what jitters means. Yes. So when we're putting this in front of kids, see, that's what I was going to say. It might give it away, but it could be a part of their question of what do I wonder? Maybe kids are wondering, what does jitters mean? Or can they make inferences about what jitters means from the picture you see here. So Chris, I don't know if it's possible to zoom in on your screen just a little bit and kind of center that Joe Jitters thing. If not, it's not a big deal. We can read it out loud together. But you're looking at a picture of a drawing of two white men talking to each other. And one is looking to another and says, did you hear what happened to Joe Jitters when Negroes moved in across the street? So what do you, without even knowing the background that I just gave you, because we're introducing this to kids, we're going to try to pique their curiosities. What are some things that they would know by looking at this? What are some things you know by looking at this? And I'll give you a second to respond in the chat or unmute yourself. And I did see that somebody had a comment about using the word Negroes, and you might have to give some historical context for the use of that word. I totally agree with you. Okay, so somebody says, it looks like it's probably in the suburbs, and the evidence that you're using is a rake that's in your hand. That's a very good clue. And I like how you cited evidence to say what I know, and I cited something in the picture. While you're typing in the chat, one of the things I really love about this particular source is that it challenges the notion that all of our sources have to be really text heavy or that they have to be a document. And a lot of times, if we can just put pictures in front of kids, it's more accessible to our emerging English language learners, our striving readers. It's more accessible to more of them. They can all participate in this. Somebody noticed that it was published by the Department of Human Relations and the Commission on Human Relations in Kansas City. It looks like it's an official document because of that. Good. What else do you know? Or maybe what do you think you know before we get into the questions you may have? What do you think you know? What do you think they might be talking about? It's likely middle-class individuals. If it's in the suburbs, what makes you, oh, and you're going back to that suburbs because of the rake in the hand. Yeah, that's a great inference. When we've talked to teachers about this before, one of the things that they bring up is that it looks like one guy might be whispering to another guy. So letting him in on a little bit of a secret. So I think this is a secret. A new neighbor might be the first minorities in the neighborhood. Okay, so maybe they're talking about these new neighborhoods because they're talking about Negroes. So they're talking about a Black family moved in. Here's two white guys talking. So you can start to infer some things there, that it might be gossiping. Yeah, that's great. So what are some things you wonder? What are some questions you have or some things that you want to know? If this is the only thing that you're seeing right here. You can feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat. Somebody's asking, what comes next? What happened? Wonder what the rest of this story is, right? Especially if they thought, oh, they're gossiping about something. Are they gossiping about the new neighbors? But what might that sourcing information suggest? They may think about home values. Yeah. Yeah, Robert says, why would the Department of Human Relations and the Commission of Human Relations publish this? That seems really interesting. And maybe students wouldn't even know what that means, right? Maybe it's actually something positive that's being spoken because it was the Human Relations group that's publishing this thing. Great job. So you can see that what we did is we just verbally kind of walked through that initial sources analysis sheet just for that first category. Somebody asked, was this an image used across the country or only in Kansas City? That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. I love saying that to kids. That's a good one. Let's go see if we can find that one out. Throughout the time that Scott and I have been looking at different sources regarding blockbusting, I can say that I haven't seen it published elsewhere yet, but that certainly doesn't mean that it wasn't. But Students might wonder that for sure. Okay, we can go back to the sources or to the investigation. So that was the first section, is that is going to be our fundamental source that we're going to go back to a couple of times throughout this investigation. So now we're going to kind of organize our thoughts. There's the O. We're going to have a whole class discussion, or in this case, a whole webinar discussion, and pose questions, maybe through a polling application is what you might use with your students if you have 25 kids in there, to help manage their ability to be able to everybody participate. But right now, we can kind of ask some of these questions together. How about where you live right now? What is the demographic makeup of your neighborhood? Well, you tell us that in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and unmute, I'll tell you the demographics of my neighborhood. I know that my kids' school is about 82% white. Our neighborhood is probably like our actual neighborhood that has a little name is probably the same. But there are other parts of our city, pockets of our city where it's certainly more diverse than that. So we are a predominantly white city where I live. What about you? What do your demographics look like? White, middle class, lots of kids, lots of university or education professionals where you can literally see the stadium from the corner. Yeah, your students might talk about jobs that people have or recognize the socioeconomic status. I am definitely in one of those areas where it's getting so expensive to live here that our and I don't live in Olathe. I live in Lee Summit, Missouri, just on the other side of state line. And it's becoming so expensive that the population numbers of our elementary schools are dropping because young families cannot afford to live here. But then our secondary numbers are going up. So that's what ours looks like. What about somebody else? What is the demographics of your neighborhood look like? Primarily white, middle class, wide range of ages. Okay. So students, the whole point of asking these kinds of questions is to get students thinking about what is around me right now and what might be some questions to ask. How did we get here? Because one of the most critical things when we're studying history is that it helps us understand our present and how were decisions that were made 50, 60, 70 years ago impacting what our local cities look like right now. So another one is, in what ways have you seen maybe your neighborhood or your school's neighborhood demographics change over time? So as long as you've been there, what might you say? And while you're typing that out, I will say we talk to our kids a lot about race and how important diversity is to us, so much that we're actually moving to a different city so that we can be around more diverse people. But every time there's a new family of color that moves in, my kids definitely notice and they're excited about it. And there's like, oh, there's diversity coming to our neighborhood, and they get really excited about it. So what kind of changes have you seen? Somebody says the local high school has increased in diversity primarily through busing. Isn't that interesting? And I wonder if our secondary students would know that. Do they know that kids are being bused in, and do they know why they're being bused in? They do. That's interesting. I wonder what they think about that. Do they know the purpose of busing in the first place was to maybe help respond to this white flight or respond to these either redlining or blockbusting issues that were happening?
And Tina, that made me think of when I was growing up, because my parents are both teachers. And so when I was younger, I always wondered when my mother would go to have a parent-teacher conference night, and my father did as well. My mother taught elementary school and my father taught high school. We had a very skinny, long county, Pinellas County here in Florida. So anybody who knows it's the peninsula on the west coast of Florida, but it's a very skinny, long county that there was quite a bit of busing, and many of the students would have an hour and a half, 2-hour bus ride, or at least from the time they, stepped out to the corner to wait for the bus until they actually got off the bus, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours. So they'd end up having to have conferences in other areas of the county because there's much of the African-American population in southern Pinellas County, and that's where we live. That's where my dad taught, but my mother taught at an elementary school a little further up county. So it was kind of both of them sometimes would have to have meetings, or they would utilize community centers or schools in different communities, because it became very difficult for and often almost impossible for parents to come for the conferences. So I think that plays into this. And then I was also thinking with my neighborhood school, I'm about a block from a school that was featured on 60 Minutes for a large migrant population. So the challenges teachers have, and the students as well, when their friends, happen to come and go quite frequently throughout the year, or the teachers reteaching the same content. So when we've talked about this, I often think about that as a challenge for the students, and thinking about this kind of topic, and how not only the neighborhoods change, but even their friends may change frequently because they move, and there's that constant turnover.
Yeah, that adds to a real complexity to this issue here too. Somebody said that their wife was in Pinellas Park. Am I saying that right?
Yes.
And that she was bused. So
Yes.
that's interesting. I don't remember ever having that, but I do remember that my family participated in white flight. We were in a suburb much closer to Kansas City. And I remember I was about 5 or 6 years old, and my dad saying, we have to get out of this town because the Black families are moving in. And that was just forever ingrained in my mind, because my best friend was next door and she was Black, and I didn't understand why this was a problem. Why do we have to move away from my friend? And of course, I didn't understand it then. I just remember thinking, this doesn't make sense to me. And I was just a little kid. And then we moved into a very white neighborhood, or town even, next door, just one town over. So to what extent then, the third question here is, does the race of the inhabitants of a neighborhood affect the home values? And this is kind of a tricky question. We want to make sure that students understand that the race of the person living in the house, or the skin tone of the person living in the house, does not change how much the wood and the drywall and the light fixtures are actually worth. But that this social construct of race has created this fake situation, or these fake beliefs, that then money followed or didn't follow, that became a reality. But we can continue to try to buck against that system. And a lot of times students may realize, oh, I can buy a house in a certain city for way less than another city 20 miles away. Why is that? And making sure that they understand the role that race likely played in why those home values are so different, and even why people fight over the way that school funding is allocated based on that property value, which obviously continues to privilege the already privileged populations. So now that we've organized our thoughts, students feel like they have been able to contribute, we can move into understanding the context. So we kind of want to situate blockbusting. We haven't really introduced it yet. We've just shown this Joe Jitters, starting to talk about your school community or the neighborhood where you actually live, and students might not understand how these two things are related. So let's start to tell them and share with them what has happened in the past. These are a couple of really great websites. The first one, I think the link might just need to be updated. So if you click on that first one, the Black.org website, it will take you to the blackpast.org, and it will talk about the history of blockbusting across the country and give kids a little bit more background on this very complex topic. I'm using really big, complex words with you as adults, but obviously students are going to need a little bit more scaffolding there. The second thing, this blockbusting in Baltimore, I absolutely love. This is a YouTube video that somebody has piecemealed together. It's about a 30-minute long video, but it is made up of 5 installments from this local news reporter, Christopher Gall, which originally aired in 1970. And so by clicking on this, you can watch a little 5-minute, 7-minute blurb of him doing an expose, if you will, about blockbusting. So basically, he's trying to expose the lie and expose the corruption of real estate agents and banks that were in on this together, to prey on what it is that people don't know is happening to them. So I love that expose feeling. I love the way that he kind of walks through it. He also brings in members of the community. So he interviews Black families, and that's where you would get some information about how they feel like they were tricked into a rent to own. And then several years later, they've built no equity. still don't own the house. And then they'll talk about white families that realized that they were pawns in this whole game as well. And that there were white families that would demonstrate their allyship by fighting against the people that were doing the blockbusting and saying, I'm not going to move out of my house. I'm not going to let you do this to us. We're going to expose you. We're going to maybe create laws at the local level in local municipalities. I don't want to get ahead of myself here. So let me, okay, I don't want to out one of the resources we're going to use here in just a minute. So if you can, let's see, the third one, the social justice book website. So this is where Scott was talking about anytime you can build context using children's literature, it's an excellent way to do that. I know that even when I taught juniors and seniors, when I brought in Dr. Seuss books to teach about racism, they were riveted because they didn't get in the text or the content of the children's literature didn't get in the way from complex understanding and thinking and analyzing. So don't shy away from using children's resources, even if the children's resource is really for primary or intermediate age and you teach high school, still has a space in our classrooms. But also some children's literature is written for adolescents. And so you can certainly use those pieces as well. And there's some materials there. And then you see a couple of books by their titles and their authors that we would like to recommend to you. Okay, so now that you know a little, the kids would know a little bit more about blockbusting. So I want you to kind of come back to this conversation, knowing all this stuff that I've told you so far. Now let's go back to that Joe Jitters piece and think about, we're going to return to that fundamental source. What might we understand more about now, or using what we know now would help shape the way that we view that fundamental source. So Chris, if you could scroll back up so we can see the whole Joe Jitters piece again and give everybody a chance to take a look at it. And some of the questions that you even had before. So we did that. What do you know? What do you think? And what do you still have questions about? Were some of your questions answered so far? So obviously by initiating that inquiry early on with students, then they're going to now be reading and listening to these sources with those questions in mind. So the blackpast.org link has been fixed, which is awesome. So if, now that you're looking at this, one of the questions somebody had earlier was, why would the Department of Human Relations be involved in this? What do you think now? Now, based on everything that you know about blockbusting, which obviously isn't all there is to know, but now that you know more, why do you think the Department of Human Relations might have been involved in this? And how do you think they might have used this item, which I could disclose now? This was a pamphlet. This is just the front page of a 4-page pamphlet. But we didn't want to bog down students with a lot of text. So now while I'm waiting for you to answer that in the chat about how you view this differently, what do you know more about? What are you thinking about differently? And what are maybe some new questions you have? This is a great time to then really focus in on the text. Joe Jitters, what does jitters mean? And how then, by knowing what that word means, how might that shape your interpretation of what is happening in the photo? So or in the drawing, does anybody have any guesses about what they think is happening here? Maybe Joe Jitters was convinced to sell his house. And if he was, maybe he lost a lot of money on his house to get out. Maybe students would hopefully understand the impacts of white flight, discrimination, blockbusting. Yeah. They might think about the ethics of realtors. So, maybe the real estate agent was in on this. Maybe we just watched this 5-part expose on what real estate agents were doing. So maybe Joe Jitters was a victim of blockbusting. The cartoon is an effort to say there is no reason to be jittery. Right. That's a great thing there too. So notice when we go through this framework, starting with just that first initial source, there were some things that we could start to question and infer. But it took us organizing our thoughts a little bit, understanding that context, and reading some more of those sources to be able to come back to this and say, okay, what do I see and think about differently now? And the thing that I think is so exciting about that part is that a lot of times as adults, it's hard for us to change our minds about something, especially like related to public policy. So the hope would be now that we could point out to students what you once thought hopefully is now shaped or a little bit different because you learn more information. And that is so critical to being an active citizen and engaged in our democracy, is that we're always committed to getting more information and always being open to changing our minds once we get that additional information. Okay, Chris, can you scroll down a little bit more for me? So now that we've returned to the fundamental source, now we're going to corroborate and refute. Chris, can you go ahead and click on that first one for me? This one is pretty short, so we're going to show it on your screen. I don't know if there's any way to make that a little bit bigger. If not, I might be able to read it for those of you that might have a tiny computer screen like me. So this is Alice Hughes, and this is her testimony. She is a white former resident of Edmondson Village, and she actually used an alias to participate in this interview. And she was in Southwest Baltimore, and she outlined this practice of blockbusting and how unscrupulous fortune hunters took advantage of people. And here was a little bit of her testimony. She said that, I recall that about 1960, Gold Seeker came into the neighborhood, and he, presumably an agent for that company, went door to door, literally offering people a large sum of money for their house. I would say to the sum of $15,000, at least that's what I heard offered on my street. And then those people who moved immediately got that. And then those who waited until after the neighborhood was broken, as they called it, so just put broken in air quotes there, got half of that. And so these were people that were being ripped off. Say, oh, you didn't take advantage soon enough, and now we hope you're super scared, and so now we're going to come at you at $50,000 less. She talks about how her own family was victim to this, and they got $8,000 or $8,500 when they moved, but they gave it as a trade-in and they bought a house elsewhere. What Gold Seeker was doing was buying a house for $15,000 and almost giving it away to get a Black family in there. And then he would buy a house for $6,000 and then sell it for $15,000. That is how he made his money on the deal. So there's a PDF there that shares Alice's testimony and about what happened to her family. Okay, can we go ahead and go back, Chris, and let's take a look at another one. So the East Cleveland Leader article. So I hope that what you're seeing now is we've shown you evidence from Kansas City. We've shown you evidence from Baltimore. Now we're showing you some evidence from Cleveland to show that this was a really rampant problem. In 1961, the paper reported that city commissioners in Cleveland, Ohio were set to deliberate an ordinance designed to curb blockbusting that mirrored that of a neighborhood council in Ohio. Here's what the ordinance said. Quote, no person shall promote or influence a property owner, an occupant, or tenant to list for sale, sell, remove from, or lease real property by referring to race, color, religion, or national origin of the neighbors, the tenants, the prospective buyers, or occupants of real property, resort to or engage in any intimidation or threats in attempting to influence or induce a property owner or tenant to list for sale, sell, remove from, or lease real property. The ordinance carries a $50 fine on conviction for the first offense and a $500 maximum for subsequent evictions. So what we're looking at, remember just what this category is that we're looking to corroborate or to refute blockbusting. So hopefully that what you're seeing here is that we're corroborating that this is an issue. It's happening everywhere. We've got some personal testimonies. We have some city councils who are actually trying to mitigate it, trying to stop it. And then the third one is under that same category is of a family in Kansas City who faced a lot of those same issues, also again in the 1950s. And he outlined what happened when his family moved into a white neighborhood. He said that there was a pastor of a church, and he got his members to put up signs in their yards saying, quote, "This house is not for sale," end quote. So clearly they're sending a message to the real estate agents, don't come knocking, we're not interested. He said, in 1955, I moved near Central High School, and I was the second Black in the block. Some blocks accepted Blacks, but the whites did not stay. One lady who used to live down the street, I don't remember her name, she said, quote, "Oh, we want to welcome you to our neighborhood. We're not going to move. We're just going to stay here and raise our family," end quote. And a month later, the house went up for sale. So when you have students thinking about, did blockbusting really happen? Was this really a coordinated effort? Because sometimes when we look back at systemic racism across the country, some people try to give a pass or an excuse and say, oh, people didn't really know. That wasn't really on purpose. It just kind of happened that way. And this is showing you that this is actually very coordinated effort, and across the whole country, this was a problem. And what's interesting is that the cities were trying to tackle these issues before maybe Congress did or does. And you might be wondering, what did Congress do? And we've got more resources that you can go and learn more about that. And so then at the end, when you establish a plausible narrative, go back to that original question that we're asking students, which is, in what ways did the blockbusting impact a neighborhood and the individuals living there or moving there? So going back to that question, how do you think, go ahead and drop it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself. In what ways do you see blockbusting impacting different groups of people, both living in the neighborhoods or moving to the neighborhoods? What do you see now that you've looked at all of this evidence and you've corroborated it and you've looked for counter evidence? What do you see? Or what do you think students might say? And while you do that, there is a great link in the chat that's useful related sources about what racial covenants are. In that book, Race, Real Estate, and Uneven Development, the Kansas City Experience, he has some really rich resources in there about covenants by county that surround the Kansas City area, and how after white flight, they really preserved keeping white people only in some of these counties. And here we are again, even though housing laws have been passed since the 1970s, we still see overwhelmingly white entire counties just outside of Kansas City. So somebody says that it impacted home values. Right, even though it shouldn't have, it did, because they rigged the system and they used the demographics of the neighborhood to be able to do that. And it did contribute to white flight. Also, somebody said that blockbusting preyed on the fears of people to make a profit. There's a lot of victims here. And we even found some resources in Baltimore where real estate agents were bragging about what they did. They didn't feel bad. They were like, I'm making money. So that was interesting. Somebody else said they might think about what they might do if they were living in a neighborhood that was impacted by blockbusting. So kind of taking that back to the present day. Well, did that happen in my neighborhood? Is that why my neighborhood looks the way that it does? And it would be interesting to have them to go interview their parents or their grandparents. It's a great idea, about their experiences with blockbusting or white flight and why things are the way they are. Or initiate a really great conversation with them, because maybe they are like, I've never thought of that before, or it wasn't on my radar. Because there's a lot of things that when you're in the dominant culture in an area that you don't see because you maybe weren't directly adversely affected by it. But this is clearly an issue across the country. And then when you consider like what kind of assessments kids could do, like could they create like a TikTok video that talks about the blockbusting that happened in their community? Or maybe what are they going to do to help bridge some barriers that have been built by the generations that came before them? Maybe they're going to build a website and help share that knowledge with the people around them. And then to summarize their final thoughts, students are asked to critically examine that investigation process. Let's talk about this whole process that we just went through, the way that we corroborated evidence, the way that we pulled evidence from the time period, and you got to see and hear their voices, their words, their experiences, and how all of these different pieces of evidence really backed each other up around a certain time period and around what exactly was happening. Ask them what they learned and have them reflect on their learning a little bit and ask them what questions still exist. So how about for you? Maybe you can drop in the chat. What are some things that you learned today in this very brief webinar? And what are some questions that you might have? And if somebody asked earlier about whether or not this pamphlet was used elsewhere, that's a question that I have. I wonder if the cities talked to each other. How are we going to curb blockbusting in our town? So go ahead and drop in the chat what you learned or what questions still exist. And I still have questions about what kinds of policies have been able to circumvent housing discrimination laws that were passed. We know that, if the average white family is making a lot more money than the average Black family, and if the cost of housing continues to go up, that is another way to maintain segregated communities where we live. So feel free to drop that in the chat from now until this webinar is over, and we will happily include your comments. And I'm going to turn it over to Scott for him to talk a little bit more about how you can learn more about the technology that can be used and upcoming conferences to learn more about using primary sources in your class.
All right, awesome, Tina. And now you guys see why I really enjoy working with Tina. She's phenomenal. She does an amazing job presenting. It's a joy to be able to collaborate with her. And as you see, she's got some amazing ideas, and she's lived through this in Kansas City. So she's not only the expert of pedagogy, but she's lived it, on the ground per se. So that's why I'm really thrilled to have been able to work with her on this project. And hopefully you'll be able to read about it in the actual manuscript once it's published. What I did is I also worked with one of my colleagues at the University of Central Florida, Dr. Richard Hartshorn. He's in instructional design and technology. And I asked him about these stages and what emerging technologies might work best. He's become really familiar with the framework. We've worked together on a couple projects and a book together. So he knows of my framework. So I worked with him in trying to find some of the best emerging technologies. So you'll see that link there. It does pop up under the more on the Weebly site, but you can go later and take a look at some of these. Some of them are going to be familiar, and some of them hopefully will be new. But then also you'll be able to think about how you might use them throughout the different stages. So they don't necessarily have to be used within the discrete sections or stages of this framework. It just happens to be where they might work best, or an idea that we had when we sat down and talked about where these emerging technologies might lie. So when you get a chance, go back to it's blockbusting.weebly.com. Go and take a look at all the resources, look at that. But one other thing I want to make sure you know about, yes, Chris, the conference. So every January, some of you know, and hopefully a lot of you know who are watching this video, and Chris, it's maybe if you don't mind sharing that screen, I think it's the way you have it set up. We don't see that. If you don't mind popping that up. But typically it's the third Saturday of every January. I have the Sources Conference at the University of Central Florida, and it is in collaboration and through the support of the Florida Council for the Social Studies, but specifically through my grant funding with the Library of Congress. So I'm very thankful for both of them, as well as the Florida Council for History Education. They've been quite helpful with my conference as well. The conference is...
Chris, if you click under more at the top, I think there's actually a tab that says conferences that should show on the Weebly itself.
Yeah, it goes to a new page. That's the problem, I think, is maybe
you're
only sharing the one screen. It does pop up the actual website. It is sourcesconference.com. So later, if you want to look at that too, you can look at sourcesconference.com. But it's the third Saturday each year, third Saturday in January each year. And it's just focused in on teaching with primary sources. So I don't present. I just am lucky enough to host individuals there. And they're just an amazing array of experts on teaching with primary sources who show up and give amazing presentations each year. A great turnout. So I really encourage you, if you don't know about it and haven't attended, please try to attend this coming year. As I said, the third Saturday. I just don't remember the date off the top of my head, but it is the third Saturday in January on the campus of the University of Central Florida. I think we only have about 5 minutes left to talk. I would love, and thank you, Robert. So it is the 15th. I thought it might have been. So yeah, so the 15th of January.
I love that somebody had a question about what other potentially difficult topics have you developed using the sources framework? And I'll let Scott answer that in just a second. One of the things that I just want to comment about that is that I think that primary source evidence it's an equalizer, it's a stabilizer, and it's inarguable, right? So like this is what people said then, and we need to learn how to think about that. And we need to consider the context in which it was said, who the audience was. And so I think that anytime we can let the sources speak and the people from the past speak, it helps to really calm down otherwise really contentious issues. And so for me, that's always the approach that I take in talking about controversial issues. So that way it's not me lecturing and they're saying the teacher's doing something or saying something. Like, let's just see what the sources say. And then we can try to make sense of it from there. And then let the kids draw their own conclusions about where do you see maybe present day impact of some of these things. And you don't have to say anything. The sources can do it for you.
Absolutely. And we both work with a lot of those induction phase year teachers, in the first 3 years of teaching. And I remember, my first year of teaching that an administration that wasn't really supportive of teaching this way. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that we always worry about is how can they feel better, safer in approaching this type of content. And as Tina's arguing, and I argue as well, is through the sources, have them investigate that, have them go through a critical analysis like Tina did with Blockbusting here, where the sources speak for them. So yeah, I worked with several teachers on different topics, but a lot of times in the marginalized voices, those are left out of the textbook, is often what I've been tending to focus in on. So we've looked at not only African-American impacts, but those for women and other minorities and Japanese Americans, as well as other topics. One of my favorites happens to be one that really was one of my first investigations. That's from about 20 years ago, and it's about a Civil War soldier, but it really helps them to critically think not only about a human being and not 600,000 plus who were killed during the war, but it also is an individual who probably, we don't know for sure, and that's kind of the cool thing I like about a lot of these investigations too, is we have to think about the most plausible narrative and what probably happened. And maybe not all the questions are answered, but with this particular individual, he probably came from a family that were slave owners. And so then thinking critically about this, because when I lay this out, they go through this investigation and start having maybe some emotional feelings for this individual because they will get wrapped up in reading letters of his from his sister, really get critically thinking about the individual, and then later really realize that, oh, is it okay for me to have feelings of sympathy for somebody who was from a slave owning family who's fighting for the Confederacy? So I think that's one of the things that teaching with sources does, is gets them to think critically, gets them to analyze their own emotions and thoughts, but through a way of investigation. So that's really one of the things that I try to do. And I've started looking at some other topics, and I'm actually currently working with a doctoral student in science education, and we're looking at the arrest of Galileo and whether it was justified or not. So that's something new for me to really learn about, and we've just started that investigation. But I'm pretty excited to go look at some of the sources now. We were actually looking at, I spent a lot of time in the Czech Republic, so we were looking at a couple topics in the Czech Republic. And unfortunately, that's one of the issues we have when we start trying to teach world history, because I get a lot of people asking me about world history. And it's the problem that there aren't the sources available in English typically. So unless you're fluent and can transcribe easily, then sometimes that's the problem. But I'm arguing that this can be used with any topic, any content. It's a lot about building students up so that they can successfully analyze and engage, though. And I think, as I said, Tina did a phenomenal job with presenting this and showing what authentic discipline inquiry really is. Since we only have about 2-3 minutes, anything else, Tina?
I was just going to remind everybody that on that website, there was like additional sources that you could pull from for that investigation if you have students who want to go and learn more. There were some really great pieces on there about white allies that were adamant in fighting against. And a lot of times when I think about anti-racist pedagogies, one of the things I always want to think about is, can white students see themselves in other white advocates in the past? So hopefully that way they would be empowered to stand up against things that are hurting already minoritized populations. And so how can they stand up and be allies? There's some really great pieces in there. So don't forget that they're there. And I think that was the only other thing that I was going to add for that.
Well, thank you, Doctors Waring and Ellsworth. We really, truly, truly appreciate everything that you've done. And if you two will stay on just for a very quick personal thank you. Members, this is the code to be able to enter to receive your certificate. So when you go back through Event Owl, you want to make sure that you enter Web 1. Again, that's Web 1. I typed it in the chat. And once you do that, it will unlock all of those features so that you'll be able to download it so that you can submit it through your district so that you can receive one additional continuing education credit. So again, thank you to Dr. Waring, Dr. Ellsworth. We do truly, truly appreciate it. And members, you know, next week on Thursday, April 8th, Thursday, April 8th at 4 o'clock, we'll be joined by Dr. Brian Fergione of the University of Redlands. And he'll be presenting political cartoons, environmentalism, and the ethical dilemmas that they create. So we look forward to that, and you know, hopefully you'll be able to join us for that as well. So without further ado, enjoy the rest of your evenings, and we will see you soon. Thank you. Take care.
Yes, thank you.
All right. So Sheree, if you could stop recording, please. Okay, maybe.